I thought I was completely alone in the mountains that night, until a stranger stepped out of the darkness and into the light of my campfire and whispered, "Why are you with her?" I turned around. There was no one behind me, but the man stared into the empty woods and suddenly ran in pure terror. This happened to me almost 8 years ago, and I've never been able to stop thinking about it. I was in my early 20s at the time, camping alone deep in the wilderness of Upper Idaho. I wasn't some expert survivalist, but I went on long hikes fairly often and knew the basics of setting up camp, staying safe, and respecting the wildlife. That part of Idaho is no joke. Black bears, grizzlies, mountain lions, the kind of animals that make you double-check every sound you hear at night. Not many people live out there, and most hikers stick to the more popular trails closer to the main mountain range. I deliberately avoided those. I wanted to be alone. For this trip, I chose a lesser-known trail that cut through dense forest along the hills bordering the mountains. It led to a small clearing with a wide view of the peaks in the distance. The nearest popular campsite I knew of was about 3 miles away near a small lake, and I intentionally stayed far from it. The entire hike, I didn't see another person. When I reached the campsite, it was completely empty. No fire pits in use, no footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had been there recently. I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing and stacked a few large stones together to make a simple fire pit. I still had a couple hours of daylight left, so I didn't rush. I unpacked slowly, made sure my food was stored properly, and sat near the edge of the clearing just taking in the silence. When the sun finally dipped behind the mountains, I built a small fire and roasted a few marshmallows, staring up at the stars. The valley was eerily quiet. No distant traffic, no voices. Just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional animal call echoing somewhere far off in the dark. That's when the silence broke. At first, it was faint. A soft, uneven crunch of leaves coming from the forest beyond the edge of the clearing. It took my brain a second to process what I was hearing. Then it became obvious. Footsteps. Someone was walking through the woods toward my campsite. I froze, staring into the darkness between the trees, my heart beating a little faster with each step I heard. After a few moments, a figure emerged into the dim, flickering light of my campfire. It was a man. The firelight danced across him, making it hard to see his face clearly, but I could tell he was wearing a standard hiking backpack. He stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at me, then at my tent, then at the fire. Before I could even speak, he quietly said, "Sorry," barely louder than a whisper. Then he turned around and walked back into the woods the exact way he had come. I just sat there, confused. Sorry for what? Walking into my campsite by accident, startling me. It felt off, the way he spoke, the way he didn't explain himself, the way he disappeared back into the darkness without another word. I didn't feel immediately threatened, but something about the interaction unsettled me. It wasn't how people normally acted when they stumbled across someone's camp. Still, after a few minutes, the forest returned to its quiet state. The man's footsteps faded, and the night felt normal again. I tried to relax, telling myself he was probably just looking for a place to camp, and realized he'd walked into someone else's spot. I went back to staring into the fire, letting the warmth calm me. Several hours passed. Clouds rolled in, slowly covering the stars and blocking out the moonlight. The clearing grew darker, the forest beyond my camp turning into a wall of black shapes and shadows. I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed by the fire, listening to the wind and waiting for sleep to finally catch up to me. Then I heard footsteps again. This time, they were faster, rushed, uneven, like someone was moving through the woods in a panic. They came from the same direction as before. My body tensed as I stood up, my eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing. And then he stepped into the firelight again. This time, he came much closer to the fire. I could finally see him clearly. His beard was uneven and scruffy, dark hair matted and greasy, as if he'd been out there for days. His clothes were dirty, streaked with mud and pine needles, and there were dark smudges across his face that looked like dried sweat mixed with dirt. He looked exhausted, but not relieved. His eyes were wide, not the wide eyes of someone surprised, but the kind that never stopped moving. They kept flicking past me, over my shoulder, into the trees behind me. Every few seconds, his gaze snapped away from me and locked onto something in the darkness, then quickly returned to my face. He stood there, chest rising and falling, trying to catch his breath. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound calm. "It's pretty late. You should have made it to wherever you were heading by now." He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes shifted again, over my right shoulder. Then back to me. "I'm fine," he muttered. His voice was low and strained. "I didn't mean to bother you. I was just hiking." The way he said it didn't sound convincing. His tone was flat, like he was reciting something he'd already told himself 100 times. "Are you lost?" I asked. "I've got extra water and food if you need it. I can help you get back to a trail." He shook his head slowly, but his eyes never stopped moving. He kept glancing behind me. Every single time he did it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Listen," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "You look pretty shaken. If you're in trouble, you don't have to pretend you're fine." For a moment, it seemed like he didn't even hear me. Then suddenly, he locked his eyes onto mine. "You're camping here," he said. His voice was sharper now. "Yes," I replied. "Why?" His gaze flicked past me again. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. The way he said it made my stomach twist. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, the same direction he kept staring. I turned. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of trees. The forest stood perfectly still, silent except for the wind brushing through the leaves. When I looked back at him, his expression had changed. He looked afraid. Not of me, of whatever he thought was standing behind me. "Is it just you?" he asked quietly. "Are you alone? Where are the others?" My heart started pounding. "There is no one else," I said. "It's just me." His eyes narrowed, studying my face like he was trying to decide whether I was lying. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Have you been following me?" "What?" I asked. "No, I don't even know you." He didn't seem to hear my answer. His gaze snapped back over my shoulder, and this time, it didn't come back to me. He stared into the darkness behind me, frozen, completely still, his face drained of what little color it had. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Then why are you with her?" The words sent a chill through my entire body. I spun around again, heart hammering, expecting, dreading, to see someone standing just a few feet behind me. But the clearing was empty. Only shadows and trees. When I turned back to the man, pure terror had taken over his face. His eyes were wide, mouth slightly open, as if he'd just seen something impossible. And then he ran. Not back toward the trail, not toward any campsite. He sprinted straight into the forest, deeper into the darkness, crashing through branches and undergrowth until the sounds of his footsteps disappeared completely. I stood there, frozen, staring into the trees where he'd vanished. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a few long seconds I was convinced that if I turned around slowly enough, I would finally see what he'd been so afraid of. I didn't see anything, but I also didn't wait to find out. For a long moment after he disappeared, I just stood there by the fire, listening. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No insects, no distant animal calls, not even the wind in the leaves, just the crackle of the dying fire and the sound of my own breathing. I felt exposed, standing there in the open clearing, like a target. The man's words kept looping in my head. "Why are you with her?" I didn't even fully understand why those words terrified me so much. He could have been hallucinating, lost, dehydrated, delirious. But the way his eyes had locked onto something behind me, the way his entire body had tensed, it didn't feel random. It felt like he'd seen something real, I forced myself to move. My hands were shaking as I started tearing down my campsite. I didn't bother packing things neatly. I just stuffed whatever I could into my backpack, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, keys, anything I could grab quickly. The fire was still burning low, but I kicked dirt over it without even bothering to fully put it out. All I wanted was to get out of that clearing. As soon as I stepped beyond the edge of the firelight, the forest swallowed me. The darkness out there felt thicker than before. Every tree looked like a silhouette of something waiting. Every shadow felt like it could move if I wasn't looking directly at it. I started walking fast toward the trail, then faster, then almost running. Every crunch of leaves under my boots sounded too loud. Every snapped twig behind me made my heart jump into my throat. I kept turning my head, scanning the darkness between the trees, convinced I was about to see movement where there shouldn't be any, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. That heavy sensation that I wasn't alone anymore. The trail felt longer than it had on the way in. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, each bend in the path revealing nothing but more darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the trees in narrow tunnels of light, but everything outside of it felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, not crashing through branches like the man had. Soft, slow, matching my pace. I froze. The sound stopped. I stood there for several seconds, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, then slowly turned around. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty. I told myself I was imagining it, that my nerves were fried, that fear was playing tricks on me. But as I turned back around and started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked away for even a second too long, something would finally step into view. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The sight of it sitting there at the edge of the empty lot felt unreal, like I'd reached some kind of safe zone in a nightmare. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them twice before finally getting the door open and throwing myself inside. I locked the doors immediately. Only once the engine started did I finally breathe. The drive out of the forest felt endless. The road was narrow and winding, headlights cutting through thick darkness. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road behind me. But the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the highway, the tension in my body slowly began to ease, but the fear didn't leave. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I contacted the nearest ranger station and told them about the man I'd encountered. I described his appearance, the location of my campsite, the direction he ran. They took the report seriously, said they'd send someone out to check the area. They never found him. No lost hikers reported. No emergency calls. No signs of anyone else camping in that area. Just an empty trail. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe he really was lost. Maybe he was dehydrated, starving, hallucinating things in the dark. Maybe he thought I was part of some threat he'd imagined. That's the explanation that makes the most sense, but it doesn't explain the way he looked past me. It doesn't explain the certainty in his voice when he said, "Why are you with her?" And it doesn't explain why, even now, years later, when I think back on that night, I still can't shake the feeling that he wasn't the most dangerous thing out there in those woods. Next story. I thought pulling an all-nighter would be the worst part of my night. I was wrong, because while I was sitting at my desk, exhausted, trying to finish my work, someone was already inside my house, standing in the dark, watching me from only a few feet away, and I didn't realize it until I opened my closet. This happened one night when I was home alone, planning to pull an all-nighter to catch up on work I'd put off for far too long. Deadlines were closing in, and with a couple other responsibilities coming up, I didn't really have a choice. It was either stay up and finish everything, or deal with the consequences the next morning. So I brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, carried it upstairs to my office, and shut the door behind me to block out any distractions. The house was quiet. The kind of late-night silence where every small sound feels louder than it should. I told myself I'd just power through the night and be done with it. For the first few hours, I actually managed to focus. I sipped my coffee, stared at my screen, and typed away. But as the caffeine wore off, so did my energy. My eyes felt heavy, my head was foggy, and the words on my screen started to blur together. I figured stretching my legs and grabbing another cup of coffee might help reset my brain. I went downstairs to the kitchen. As the coffee machine hummed to life, I noticed something felt off. The downstairs was noticeably colder than the rest of the house. It wasn't just a chill, it felt like a draft, like cold air was seeping in from somewhere. I checked the thermostat. The heat was on, but the temperature was several degrees lower than it should have been. That didn't make sense. I started walking through the living room, trying to figure out where the cold air was coming from. That's when I saw it. One of the back windows was wide open, not cracked, not slightly ajar, wide open. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, my stomach tightening. I sometimes opened the windows during the day to let fresh air in, but I was almost certain I always closed them before night. And even if I had forgotten, I never opened them that far. For a brief second, a much darker thought crossed my mind. What if someone had opened it? I slowly approached the window and leaned out, shining my phone's light toward the ground below. I didn't see any obvious footprints in the dirt. No disturbed soil. No marks on the window frame. Nothing that clearly suggested someone had climbed inside. Your brain does a funny thing in moments like that. It tries to protect you by downplaying the fear, by convincing you that you're just tired, that you're overthinking it. That stuff like this doesn't really happen to you, so I told myself I must have opened the window earlier and forgotten about it. I closed it, locked it, grabbed my fresh cup of coffee, and went back upstairs. But the unease didn't leave. About 30 minutes later, I found myself wandering the house again, quietly checking each room, each hallway, just to reassure myself that I was alone. Everything looked normal. No doors open, no lights on, no movement, nothing. I went back to my office and tried to work. Another hour passed. My mind was barely functioning when suddenly, a loud thump sounded from directly behind me. It was so sudden and heavy that I jolted in my chair. The sound felt like it came from the wall just behind my desk. My heart started pounding. My bedroom was on the other side of that wall, so I assumed something had fallen in there. Still, the sound was too loud to ignore, and with the open window from earlier still fresh in my mind, the fear crept back in. I stepped into the hallway and slowly opened my bedroom door. Everything looked normal. Nothing on the floor, nothing knocked over, no signs of anything out of place. I searched the room more carefully, but there was nothing that could have made a noise like that. I started to wonder if the exhaustion was getting to me. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. I went back to my office, but I couldn't focus anymore. I kept replaying the sound in my head. It was too real, too loud, too close. After 15 minutes of trying and failing to work, I turned around in my chair and stared at the wall behind my desk. That's when I noticed the closet. A small, narrow closet I used to store old jackets and winter clothes. It blended into the wall so well that I'd almost forgotten it was there. The sound suddenly made sense. Slowly, I stood up and walked toward it. I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't think I'd find anything. I reached out and slid the closet door open and came face to face with a man. For a split second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. There was a man standing inside my closet. He was wedged behind layers of hanging jackets and coats, his face only inches from mine. His eyes were wide, unblinking. The smell of stale sweat and damp fabric hit me at the same time the fear did. If not for the thin barrier of clothing between us, he could have reached out and grabbed me before I even had a chance to react. Time seemed to slow down. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze. Then the man moved. The coats were ripped aside as he forced his way forward, the entire closet rod shaking violently. The sound of hangers clattering to the floor snapped me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backward, turned, and ran into the hallway as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I heard the closet door slam open. Then I heard his footsteps, heavy, fast, too close. As I sprinted down the hallway, he called out my name, not yelling it, not screaming. He said it slowly, clearly, in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Hearing my own name in a stranger's mouth made my blood run cold. That was the moment the situation became something more than just a break-in. This wasn't random. This wasn't some drunk person who wandered into the wrong house. He knew me. I burst down the stairs, nearly slipping on the last step, and flung the front door open. Cold air rushed into my face as I ran outside barefoot, not even thinking about the night air or what I was wearing. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear him shouting. But he wasn't chasing me the way I expected. He wasn't sprinting after me. Instead, he was calling out, telling me to stop, telling me that he just wanted to talk. His voice echoed down the street, distorted and desperate. I didn't slow down. I ran to my neighbor's house around the corner and pounded on their door with everything I had. I must have looked unhinged, breathless, shaking, half-dressed. It took a few seconds before they opened the door, and when they did, I nearly collapsed into their entryway. They called the police for me. By the time officers arrived and went back to my house, the man was gone. There were no clear signs of where he had run. No footprints, no broken doors. Nothing obvious except the open window in the back of the living room, the same one I had found earlier. That was how he got in. The officers searched the house, the closet, the bedrooms, every room. Nothing. The house felt different after that. Wrong. Like the walls themselves were holding on to something I couldn't see. Later, when everything finally settled, the reality of what had almost happened hit me. He hadn't just broken in and hidden. He had waited. At some point, while I was downstairs checking the house after noticing the open window, he had quietly made his way upstairs and slipped into my office closet. He'd stood there, motionless, surrounded by coats, listening to me walk around the house below him. Then he stayed there, for over an hour, while I sat at my desk, typing, while I yawned and rubbed my eyes, while I complained quietly to myself about being tired. He was standing just a few feet behind me the entire time, watching, and the worst part, he knew my name. That meant he wasn't just some random intruder. He hadn't picked my house by accident. He didn't stumble in looking for shelter. He came there for me. I never found out who he was. The police couldn't identify him. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no camera footage, no trail to follow. Sometimes I think about how easily things could have gone differently. If I had gone to bed instead of staying up that night, if I hadn't noticed the window, if I hadn't turned around and opened that closet, I don't think I would be here right now. And the part that still keeps me awake some nights is knowing that someone out there once stood in the dark, inside my home, watching me work, waiting for the moment I finally fell asleep. Next story. I thought I was just being paranoid. A quiet suburban street. A short walk home. One car that offered me a ride, and then disappeared. But when I finally realized the car was empty, and the man was no longer inside it, I understood something was very, very wrong. This happened just about a month ago, and I still catch myself replaying it in my head at night. It was the weekend, and normally I would have stayed home, ordered food, and done absolutely nothing. But this Saturday was different. One of my closest friends was celebrating her birthday, and even though I'm not much of a party person, I didn't want to miss it. It wasn't really a party in the traditional sense, just our small group of friends, sitting around, having a few drinks, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The kind of night that feels harmless and forgettable. I lived in an apartment only about a 10-minute drive from her place, so I drove over around 6:30 p.m., planning to head home before it got too late. Of course, that didn't happen. As the night went on, a few drinks turned into a few more, and by the time I checked the time, It was already past 1 a.m. Most of the group had either left or decided to crash there for the night. I've never liked sleeping anywhere but my own bed, but I also knew I was still a little tipsy. Driving wasn't an option. So, against my better judgment, I decided to walk back to my apartment. My friend insisted I leave my car in her driveway and just pick it up the next day. I'd made the walk plenty of times before. It was about 25 to 30 minutes through quiet suburban streets. I'd never had any problems before. The neighborhood was usually peaceful, almost eerily calm at night. I said goodbye to everyone still there, pulled my jacket tighter around myself, and started the walk home. The air was cool, and the streets were completely silent. No passing cars, no people outside, no lights on in the houses. It felt like the entire neighborhood was asleep, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound louder than they should. A few minutes into the walk, a pair of headlights appeared behind me. They weren't bright, and the car was moving slowly, almost creeping down the road. As it approached me, it rolled to a stop. The driver cracked his window just slightly. It was too dark to see his face clearly. A man's voice came from inside the car. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" His tone sounded calm, almost polite, not aggressive, not threatening. I told him I was fine and thanked him. Without saying anything else, he rolled the window back up and drove off. At the time, I didn't think much of it. If anything, I told myself it was kind of nice that someone had checked to make sure I was okay. From his voice alone, he sounded genuinely concerned. I kept walking. A few more minutes passed, and the neighborhood was just as quiet as before. But then, I noticed a street sign ahead of me reflect light from behind. I turned around. It was the same car. This time, it was coming from the opposite direction. My stomach tightened slightly. I watched as the car slowed down again, but instead of passing me, it pulled off to the side of the road and parked. Not in a driveway, not along the curb, just stopped. I kept walking, trying not to stare. I glanced back a few times. The car didn't move. The driver didn't get out. Eventually, it disappeared out of sight behind me. I told myself I was overthinking it, but something about the timing felt off. By this point, I was about 10 minutes from my apartment. I tried to relax, telling myself it was nothing more than a coincidence. Still, walking alone in the middle of the night has a way of making even normal things feel suspicious. That's when I noticed a car parked further up the road. Its headlights were on, but it wasn't parked on the side of the street. It wasn't pulled into a driveway. It was stopped right in the middle of the road. As I got closer, my chest tightened. It was the same car. A cold wave of realization washed over me. The odds of this being random were shrinking by the second. From where I stood, there were only two ways to get back to my apartment. Normally, I stayed on this main road because it took me most of the way there, but there was also a narrow walking path through a nearby park that cut through the woods. I rarely used it. There were no lights, and at night, it felt unsafe. But suddenly, walking past that car felt worse. As I approached the intersection where the wooded path began, I realized something else. The car was parked unnervingly close to the entrance of the trail, close enough that I could reach the path before passing the car. But it almost felt intentional, like the car was positioned to force me into choosing between two bad options. I slowed my steps, scanning the dark trees. The woods felt wrong, too dark, too quiet. My gut screamed at me to stay on the road. So I did. I walked past the entrance to the woods and toward the car, every muscle in my body tense. My breath felt shallow as I passed it. Nothing happened. No door opened. No voice called out. When I reached the front of the car, I glanced through the windshield. There was no one inside. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The car was running. The headlights were on. But the car was abandoned. A chill ran down my spine. Slowly, I turned my head back toward the woods. And that's when I saw him. A man stood just beyond the tree line, partially hidden by the darkness. I could barely make out his shape, but I could tell he was watching me. That was enough. I ran. As I took off, I heard a car door slam shut behind me. Seconds later, an engine revved. My hands shook as I pulled my phone out while running. Maybe it was the sight of the phone. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't the easy target he thought I'd be. But instead of following me, the car suddenly made a sharp U-turn and sped away. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment door. Later, I reported everything to the police. It felt dramatic to say it out loud, but it honestly felt like an attempted kidnapping. Too many coincidences, too many calculated movements. What still haunts me is the realization that if I had chosen the safer option, the dark path through the woods, I would have walked straight into whatever he had planned. And out there, in the dark, alone, I don't think I would have made it back.